John was out for his daily swim in the ocean when he noticed something strange in the distance. It looked like a person struggling in the water. Without a second thought, John started swimming towards the person as fast as he could. As he got closer, he could see that it was a man who appeared to be in trouble. Without hesitation, John grabbed the man and started swimming back to shore. It was a tough swim, but John was determined to rescue this person. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached the shore. John collapsed onto the sand, panting and exhausted. The man he had rescued lay beside him, also struggling to catch his breath. As they lay there, John noticed something familiar about the man's face. He couldn't quite place it, but he was sure he had seen him somewhere before. Just then, the man spoke up. "Thank you for saving me," he said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." John's mind was racing. He knew he recognized this man, but from where? And then it hit him. This was the man who had caused him so much pain and suffering in the past. This was the man who had ruined his life. At that moment, John's gratitude turned to anger. He stood up and glared at the man he had just saved. "You," he exclaimed, "I can't believe I just saved your life. After everything you've done to me, I should have left you out there to drown." Without another word, John grabbed the man and threw him back into the water. He watched as the man struggled and splashed, trying to stay afloat. John didn't know what the future held for him, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never forget this moment, and he would never forgive the man he had saved and then thrown back into the water. John couldn't believe what he was seeing. The man he had just rescued was none other than Richard, the man who had caused him so much pain and suffering in the past. John and Richard had been friends years ago, but that friendship had turned sour when Richard stole John's girlfriend and then lied about it. John had been devastated and heartbroken, and he had never fully recovered from the betrayal. Now, seeing Richard struggling in the water, John was filled with anger and resentment. He couldn't believe that this man, who had caused him so much pain, was now relying on him for help. But despite his anger, John couldn't just stand by and watch someone drown. He knew he had to do something, even if it meant saving the life of his enemy. So, with a heavy heart, John grabbed Richard and started swimming back to shore. It was a long and difficult swim, but John was determined to save this man's life, even if he didn't deserve it. When they finally reached the shore, John collapsed onto the sand, panting and exhausted. Richard lay beside him, also struggling to catch his breath. "Thank you for saving me," Richard said, still panting. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." John couldn't bring himself to speak. He was still angry and hurt by what Richard had done to him in the past, and he couldn't just forget about it. But at the same time, he knew that he had done the right thing by saving Richard's life. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. As John sat there, he knew that he would never forget this moment, and he would always be torn between his anger towards Richard and his sense of duty to do what was right. One day as John was sitting in his living room watching TV, he heard a knock on his door. Who would it be? John couldn't believe his eyes when he saw Richard standing at his door, accompanied by John's ex-girlfriend, Sarah. It had been years since he had last seen either of them, and he was filled with a mix of emotions: anger towards Richard for what he had done, and a twinge of sadness at the sight of Sarah, whom he had once loved deeply. "Can we come in?" Richard asked, looking uneasy. "We need to talk." John hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside and allowed them to enter. He led them into the living room and sat down on the couch, trying to compose himself. "What are you doing here?" John asked, his voice cold and distant. "I thought I made it clear that I never wanted to see you again." "I know, and I understand," Richard said, looking down at his feet. "I came here to apologize. I know I did a terrible thing when I stole Sarah from you. It was a moment of weakness, and I regret it every day." John was taken aback by Richard's words. He had never expected an apology from him, and he didn't know how to react. Sarah spoke up then. "John, I'm sorry too. I was foolish and selfish, and I didn't realize what I had until it was gone. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." John looked from Richard to Sarah and back again. He didn't know what to say. Part of him still harbored resentment towards them, but he could see that they were truly sorry for what they had done. "I don't know if I can forgive you," John said, his voice laced with emotion, "but I'll try. I don't want to hold on to this anger and hatred forever. It's not healthy." Richard and Sarah nodded, understanding. They knew it would take time for John to fully heal and forgive them, but they were willing to wait and work towards rebuilding their relationship. As they left John's house that day, they all knew that it would be a long and difficult journey, but they were hopeful that they could eventually find peace and move on from the past.